Can you hear me? Hi, everybody. We're going to start. I want to talk about land acknowledgements. CalArts issued their official land acknowledgement today. You got an email. I'm going to read it to you and talk about it for a bit. The CalArts main campus sits on the unceded ancestral lands of the Chagwayavitam, the people of Chagwaya Yanga, whose present-day descendants are citizens of the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. They have been here for millennia and will forever call this place home. Through meaningful partnership and collaboration, CalArts is committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. I think this is very nice. But I have also been, because I'm charged with this, right? I've been doing research. I started doing research last year about land acknowledgements, and it's modeled on the Cal State Northridge acknowledgement, which I want to read to you because I think it does one thing that I think is better. CSUN recognizes and acknowledges the Sesevitam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Sesavenga, which is now occupied by our institution. And there's more that follows CalArts. But the key word that I think is missing from ours is occupy, and an acknowledgement that we are occupying stolen land, and that in a foundational way, we're part of the engine of settler colonialism. And I think that the land acknowledgement is not the end of what we have to do. I think it's barely a beginning. Over the last 2 years, I've been listening to them a lot, and I hear many that are rote, rehearsed, and repetitive. And I think if it has a meaning, it has to be more than a repetitive gesture. The Suquamish native poet Cedar Saigo points out what is not said. Quote, "They're not saying we're on this land. Why don't we discuss the treaties that were broken upon this land? Why don't we get specific in ways that make non-native people uncomfortable, and not just when they're expecting it, when they pay admission to hear that kind of thing? It can't just be on this, oh, this land was once occupied by these people, and saying that is enough. That is never going to be enough." So one of my resolutions is to always add something new to every land acknowledgement, and add something that helps educate us and move us from a historical past to a very contentious present. Tonight we're here for to honor and hear Carribean Fragoza. It's really a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. This is really a pleasure. So 2 days ago, on the Day of the Dead, the LA Times included Carribean on their list of Latino innovators, instigators, and power players breaking through barriers. I'm going to read part of what they say. Fragoza has been reinventing Latino tropes one project at a time. In her work as an author, editor, journalist, and artist, she's dedicated to telling stories ignored in dominant historical narratives. Just last year, her debut short story collection, Eat the Mouth That Feeds You, about Latinas navigating a male-dominated world, established Fragoza as an essential voice in American fiction. But her editing work at Quizache and at Boom has been a further seeding of the landscape with the fruit of emerging Latino writers. Fragoza co-edited the radical essay collection Traces of East, the Making of Greater El Monte, which traces the more than 300 years in the history of her hometown, where she intends to open a physical art space in the near future as co-director of the multi-disciplinary collective of the South El Monte Arts Posse, 11-year long collective. But her original work is originally vital, pushing it back against machismo across cultures. Poet and activist Vicky Vertiz credits her dangerous and creative stories with challenging the tropes of the virgin whore dichotomy, which is still in so much of our literature and culture in the United States, which as Mexican Americans, we are still struggling with or pushing back against. Most of you know that Carribean got her MFA here, but you don't know that this isn't her first time as visiting artist here, which was Gabrielle Seville brought her in a year and a half ago, right after Eat the Mouth That Feed You came out. And she so dazzled the audience that I couldn't wait until that whole cohort had left CalArts so I could bring her back. The lapidary, that means gem-like, the lapidary stories in her collection cut through our expectations of plot and character and often explore the liminal space between members of the family, between communities, and between life and death itself. You will notice a sharp attention to detail and a wariness around the traditional demands of plot, especially those of closure. At the heart of her perfectly imperfect characters are anxieties about feeling protected and protecting others. The stories open up, shake out, and rain down, many of them bonfires of prescriptive religion, culture, motherhood, and daughters' duties. Please welcome Carribean Fragoza.
That was beautiful, Matthias. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I can't believe that I'm here, like not in Zoom land, that I'm actually standing here sharing physical space with all of you, and it's beautiful to be here. I have a new appreciation for sharing physical space with people since pandemic. And I'm glad I'm alive. I'm glad you're all alive and that we're all here. And yeah, it's an honor to be back here at CalArts. I mean, it will always have a very special place in my heart, having come here for the 2 years that I did and received my MFA, and to be here in class has been a great experience. I love working in the thesis class with some of you that are here today, and then also with the BFA students. I don't think they're here, but they're sweet too. Yeah, eat the mouth that feeds you. The cover was up earlier, but I'm very proud of this slender little book that took me many, many years to write, mainly because I didn't know I had a book. I was just writing these stories while I was here at CalArts, while I was an undergraduate at UCLA. While I was having babies, I was writing these stories. While I was a substitute teacher, I was writing stories. I was just writing these stories. And eventually, thanks to my friend Vicky Vertis, I saw that all of these stories were trying to speak to each other, and that I was speaking to myself and to the characters. And there was this whole conversation happening here. They weren't just these disparate stories that were floating around in the world. They belonged together. And so when she pointed it out to me, I started to think of it as a collection. And so I'm proud of the way it came together, even though it took as long as it did. But the writing takes as long as it needs to take. I felt like a pressure when I was a younger writer to be like a successful young published writer, but I think that's kind of bullshit. Like I don't think anybody here or anywhere should feel that kind of pressure. Like you grow as the person that you need to grow into being, and as into the writer person that you need to be, and that can take time. I mean, it looks different for everybody. And so for me, I needed to do all the things that I did. I needed to travel and to have kids, even to do what I did. So then this collection was published by City Lights, and I have always admired City Lights. I mean, the writers that have been published there historically have been so influential to me. And writers that I got to know here at CalArts, like Seshu Foster, for example. I first learned of Seshu's work while I was a student here. And now Seshu has become my friend, and I admire and respect him so much. And he's also become an advocate of my work. And other people like Ben Ehrenreich, who I've met through CalArts people, has been a huge advocate of my work. And all of these advocates have played a role in getting me published where I did, which is City Lights. And I worked on this with Elaine Katzenberger, who's a fantastic editor at City Lights. And the cover, which I always love to talk about because it's such a beautiful cover.
One sec, do you want me to try to get the cover back for you?
That would be nice.
Well, I'm not, but anyone in my classes know that there's two tricks. The first trick is like, ooh, and then it's like, sometimes just that will do it. No, just literally, I mean, really, we came to show, that's it. Okay, the folder. Let me see. Sometimes, wait, sometimes it is like just hold it. This is a better step. This is where it's starting to start to make
Better than my graphics.
We had the tech guy come in earlier to try
I know,
and
he
fix
did,
it.
we've had it, but.
It's such a good cover, it's worth it, everybody.
There we go.
Okay. So before you started to read, I wanted to see what we could do.
See here.
Okay.
Whoa! Did the whole mirror thing. Cool. Oh gosh, goodness me.
So now.
Let's see.
Big.
Extend the laptop. One sec. Sorry, I have to extend it. One sec. We're here.
Okay.
We're getting there.
I have to extend it.
Trouble, just pull it
We
out.
got it.
Put it right in. Right out the remote.
Thank you.
Much nicer.
I'll take
You take that. Okay.
you.
All right.
Now I know the trick.
I'd like to have her company. Yeah, this is an image by a photographer, Mexican photographer named Graciela Iturbide, whose images have also been very influential on my work because she photographs women and girls, often indigenous women and girls. And they are often very strong personalities in the image, like this little girl. And she also has images of like indigenous women just having these very intense conversations. I have no idea what they're talking about, but I know it's good because of their body language. And I think that's something that is important to me and in my writing, my art making, because I want to bring these conversations to light. I want to give them space, and because they're important. And I often write about young girls and women, and it's my experience having once been a young girl and now as a woman and as a mother, I feel like there's a lot of storytelling that does take place, and it's something that I want to share and have conversations around. So anyway, today I'm going to read Eat the Mouth That Feeds You. It's one of the stories in the collection. I wanted to read that one because it just feels like it brings everything full circle for me. I wrote this story years ago, and the title actually precedes the story itself. I was invited by a former CalArtian from the writing program named Janice Lee to participate in a panel. I don't know or remember anything about the panel except Matthias was there. He was also invited. And the title of the panel was just so striking to me. It was Eat the Mouth That Feeds You. And it was just so compelling that I immediately said, yes, I want to be part of this panel, whatever it is that we do or talk about, I almost don't care. Yes, I want to be part of it. And then I sat down and started writing the story immediately. And in almost one sitting, I wrote a full draft of this story. And it hasn't really changed since I first wrote it out, which is kind of a miracle because there's so much editing that often goes into the writing process. But just a little backstory to this is, not really a backstory, it's just information, some context. I had, so two important things happened to me during that time that I wrote the story. My great-grandmother had just passed away, and that was shocking to me. And then my grandmother passed away shortly after that, and that was also very eye-opening to me. And then I found out I was pregnant with my first child, and I never thought I was going to be a mother because I was not interested in becoming a mother. And then somewhere along the way, I decided that it happened in Mexico City. I realized that I wanted to become a mother, and then I got to work, and it happened. So I had these big life-changing events happening at the same time, and I just was thinking about the generations that were passing, what my place was in this line of women in my family. And then now the fact that I was producing a new generation was a lot to process at that time. So that's where this story came from, just thinking about a lot of these things. So I'll read it, and I think I have time to read the whole thing, which I'm glad for. So here goes. Eat the mouth that feeds you. My daughter, for lack of memory, eats me. Sometimes in little bites throughout the day, I don't even notice it until I feel a dull pain in the ribs, and I see it is my daughter, chewing on the meat around the small bone. She sucks blood from the veins while she reads one of her books on the couch. When I hear her crunching on the bone to suck the marrow, I pretend not to notice, and I remember to rush back to the kitchen to check on a pot I left on the fire. I am here to feed her. What can I do? Sometimes my daughter, she is cruel. Sometimes she bites into my flesh, but not enough to cut far into the skin. And she watches me in her grip. Sometimes I start to pull away. Sometimes I cry out and my eyes fill with tears. Sometimes, without thinking, I say, "Why do you hurt me? You are so cruel." But it's not fair for me to say those things. It is her right. She must take those things. She must take from me what she needs. It's because I don't have answers to her questions. I don't know what to say. I never have the words, or I don't understand her questions. She asks me things I don't know how to answer. She accuses me of things that don't make sense. She started by eating the letters my mother sent me every month. When she was very young, I'd read them to her with the usual news. Your sister Adriana is unbearable with her flirting all over the place with the older men. Your brother Octavio is very good at math, but fights too much. And your father, well, you know. Remember, if the baby is crying too much, check her teeth. Check if her teeth are coming. Give her an onion to chew on. My daughter loved to smell the letters and touch the thin lined paper with her fat palms. Sometimes they smelled of chewing gum, a flat stick folded between the rule sheets for my daughter. She would lick the paper, still smelling of spearmint, lick the paper with her little tongue and smear the ink. She'd put creased pages into her mouth and let them soak, and she'd suck until the ink bled through and stained her tongue. What are you doing? I said. Her mouth, it looked like blood, but it was ink. The corners of her mouth dripping black saliva. Drink this, I said, drink this milk, drink it. Even as she got older, she liked the feel of the paper, soft, almost creamy when moistened with saliva sliding down the throat. I wondered if it could get stuck there, or if she'd paper mache her insides, eating all that paper. Would it form a delicate cast of all her organs? Or would the walls make a maze? Or would it spell out beautiful poems or complicated songs, the kind you never want to end? Now, I imagine it might look like the inside of a house. I know my daughter's house will be beautiful one day. Over the years, she has eaten enough pencils and erasers, nibbled on wooden rulers, sipped on ink from the tips of pens, and has chewed on enough paper to create a beautiful blueprint. Her insides will be a beautiful home, and she'll play music I won't understand, but it'll be like when you play the B side of an album you bought because you heard the popular songs on the radio. I have learned to love those B-side songs best of all. If you listen enough times, you will too. But my daughter, she also ate fistfuls of dirt. Into her mouth went black, wet earth, dirt crumbs, some veiny leaves and dried mud. She ate sand at the park, ground her teeth on the hard grains until they became fine dust. Once, we were visiting my family, and my daughter, she was with my sister, the single one. They sat on the lumpy bed looking at old love letters and cards and stuffed animals. They were sitting on the bed. They were eating something. It was clay. They were breaking off shards of a small pot and eating it like very fine chocolate. My sister, she said to me, "It still tastes like the river. You can remember the river like this. You can remember the waters, sweet like milk. Do you remember, sister? You can remember us when we were kids and you'd help carry the little ones on your hip all the way. Taste it. You'll remember." I took a piece. It was a dark clay, smooth and cool when you put it on your tongue, but grainy and crumbly between your teeth. My daughter chewed and chewed, watching me. I tasted the earth and I tasted the river. It was true. I could remember the little ones shivering wet in the river with their droopy underwear soggy in the sun. I said, yes, I remember. I could see our family in the shade of a large tree spread out on a large blanket. Me in my sundress, cradling the baby. I always thought it was a little funny and embarrassing the way they snuggled against my new breasts. Hey baby, I'm your sister, not your mom. My face was round then, like the moon, and there was so much more of me, hips already wide beneath the full skirts, waist cinched tight. Now look at me, Mija. Take whatever you can now. There's not much. I don't know how much more I have to give. I let her eat me. I will go in there, even though I'm afraid. But she's already eaten my mother and my grandmother. But she didn't eat them like she eats me. They're already dead. She ate their letters, all of them, even though I hid them from her, knowing she'd look for them. Then she ate their photographs, the photograph of my mother before she married my father. My father, despite his good looks, his greased up hair and creased pants, paled next to her mouth, though pretty, already curling into a sneer. I saw my daughter swallow the photograph, her own lips learning to sharpen into that scythe. When she ate my grandmother's photograph, my daughter looked at me, bewildered. It was that photograph of my grandmother when she was already a mother, had already given birth to all her children. But she sat on a beach wearing a bathing suit and shared a tall can of beer with another woman. Where was my mother? Where were her siblings? My grandfather? There was no trace of my mother, nor of me. In our faces, theirs and mine, there were no shared traces. Since always our paths had been broken, and yet we insisted on finding our way back to each other. The last time we visited my mother's home, the home where I was raised, the summer after my mother died, I thought my daughter went too far. She went into their bedrooms, which no one wanted to touch or change, because we still believed my mother or grandmother might walk right back in. My mother huffing and puffing from the market, heavy with vegetables, coffee, bits of tripe. Or my grandmother shuffling her slippers back into the house after sweeping the dirt and bad spirits off their sidewalk onto the street. All of us, the brothers and sisters, we wanted our mother and grandmother to remember their way back into the house and find all of their things right where they left them. But my daughter, who does not remember things the way we do, who hardly has any memory at all, she came into the rooms and started pulling open the drawers, flipping through the notebooks, opening the doors of the old wardrobes and smelling their contents, running and pushing her hands through everything, licking and gnawing on the edges and corners. She wasn't even really looking at anything. Then she opened the jars of beauty creams and licked the lids and yellowing rims. And then she scooped out cold cream with her fingers and ate it. She ate all of it. Then she went through the perfume bottles and sipped the amber elixirs. She gulped down bottles of holy water my mother had carried from blessed wells. She sucked the sugar skeletons my grandmother brought from Guanajuato, chewed on wax prayer candles and plastic rosary beads. The family, they always thought my daughter was a little crazy. Now they think she is possessed. But now I'm beginning to understand. Now I know what she is doing. For now, the best I can do is let her eat whatever she needs and wants. I am relieved that I know now where to find my mother and grandmother. They are inside my daughter. There's nothing I want more than to be with them again. We will live in the house my daughter has built. I'll listen to all of the records and learn the words and maybe even dance again like I used to when I was a very young woman, and my hair will be long and loose again, swinging in the room filled with music, the record player playing and playing. But this time, it'll be different, because when my brother comes looking for me, since my mother sends him every time, I will keep dancing. And when she comes looking for me herself, and when she looks at me in that way, I will be very hungry and I will be ready. I'll grab a bite from her and chew on her plump flesh, her skin so smooth and soft in my mouth. I'll start by taking a bite out of her forearm, which is the body part I remember the most. It will be soft and dark and taste like the armrest of her chair, and it will taste like the shade of the house. It will taste like clean tile and wet cement. My mother, she will pull away from me, think that I'm possessed by the devil, while I swallow her. It will be just a little bite. She won't be able to speak, not knowing what to do with her arm, usually for keeping everyone at bay. And maybe, once I start eating, I won't be able to stop. Maybe I'll eat her all up. Then I'll understand all of it. I'll understand my mother. I'll understand my daughter. I'll say, so this is it. I will say, I understand you now, my daughter, because with the taste of my mother in my mouth, with her flesh in my body and her blood in my veins, I will understand her too. My mother, I don't know, but I believe she will also understand once she's inside of me, the way I'm beginning to understand now inside of my daughter. Then she will see what she has to do. That's the end of it.
Are we up for Q&A?
I'm up for it.
You're up for Q&A.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
so had you were just pregnant when you wrote that? You had actually had your
I was,
pregnancy?
yeah, it was like first trimester.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So that's my first question.
Yeah.
That's remarkable. So I'm in your thesis class, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about something that you talked about in class. I think is so important, and I think is apparent in what you just read, which is finding courage through the voice of your characters and being able to say things in a way, or just being able to say things at all, that maybe as a human being in the world you're not able or don't have the courage or whatever you said. And having read the rest of your book, there are so many more instances of that too. I was wondering if you talk about that.
Yeah. Well, that is right. I do find every fiction writer is different, but I do find courage in the characters to say things that I don't have the courage to just say in the everyday, or even if I do, like it's not always well received. But yeah, I think gosh, I don't know. I think in this collection in particular, I was really looking to inhabit these voices of these characters and not necessarily speak for me, but like really follow their truth and like really listen to. I was listening to what they were saying, and I wanted to let them say whatever difficult things that they were experiencing and feeling. And yeah, so like I said, every fiction writer is different, but I feel like I really am trying to listen and follow that voice of that character. And sometimes the characters don't have the courage either to speak their experience or their truth to other characters in their world, but there's other things that I do as a writer that can bring that voice forward. I mean, I don't know, like dialogue can definitely bring opportunities for characters to speak their truths to each other. That is definitely a thing that happens and can happen. But sometimes outside of dialogue, I don't know, that can happen as well. So anyway, like this really was an opportunity for me to really dig into like the difficult aspects of mother-daughter relationships, for example, and like just the messiness of family life and of being the child of immigrants and that intergenerational gap that sometimes exists in immigrant families or like mixed status families as well. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I feel like not hung up at all about this being like a slender book, because I feel like it took a lot of courage to write a lot of these things here, and these characters gave me a lot of courage. And so, I don't know, I think, yeah.
It's also a monologue, right?
Yeah.
It's almost, it verges on being a rant. It has a very vocal quality, right? Like it emulates how somebody would rant.
Yeah.
It's not quite that, but
Yeah. Right.
Oh, I just had another question.
Yeah.
I didn't want to.
go.
Well, I am so interested in how you consider story in relation to essay, which is another form I know that you also work in, or just in general fiction and nonfiction. I'm just curious to know if like one has informed the other, or or how in your mind your process kind of negotiates fiction and nonfiction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. So they definitely do for me. I mean, I was just talking about dialogue, and Matthias was pointing out like the quality of the voice, and there's something that I try to capture in nonfiction, especially when I'm quoting people, where I try to, and I spoke about this earlier today, like when I'm interviewing somebody and I'm taking down the things that they say, and then when I make decisions about what quotes to use, I always want to choose things that are very specific to that person, and there's a very particular way that every single person speaks, and I want to often capture that. So I think having an ear for it or developing that and putting it to work in the fiction kind of really fine tunes that for me when I work in the essay form or the journalistic forms. So that's like one immediate aspect. And then there's also like the storytelling aspect, right? Like in fiction, I'm telling stories, and then in the journalism or in like the essays, even if it's a review, like that is just my go-to. Like I always want to tell a story, and I find ways to tell that story, or I look for the story in whatever it is that I'm writing. It could be like, like a review of an exhibit or something, or whatever. I don't know. So there's like this compulsion, I guess, to like always tell a story that is across genres for me. And sometimes I feel like, I haven't said this out loud in a while, but it's good for me to remind myself. Sometimes stories that are non-fictional, that are like real and documented perhaps, like they are so good, like they just kind of tell themselves. And sometimes I feel like I they don't really tell themselves, like, I want to be the one to like, I want to be the vehicle for that story to come to light. And so sometimes I really do feel like I'm just the instrument of that story, and I'm just trying to like bring it forward. And it doesn't need like this fictionalization. It doesn't like, it's just so good on its own. I just want to bring it. So I have stories like that too.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about what you said and enjoying what you said earlier on that, but the way you introduced that story and intergenerational relationships and how Matthias was explaining or setting up your reading, and it made me, I just wondered, as a kind of like the fantasy, what you said you were just expecting, and you'd just been through those losses when you found out you were pregnant. And I say this to someone who's been pregnant just after your cousin died, and you can, so you didn't know, presumably, when you're going to have a son or a daughter. What happens if in that story it becomes my son is eating me? What happens to that intergenerational thing of Mexican women or Mexican American women, and also the sense people have when pregnant, there's kind of succubus thing sometimes, that your artistic life, your sort of life of yourself is going to be disappear somehow or be set out of you. How, and also how would it, what we talked about machismo and gender relations in different cultures. Just I was wondering, reflecting on what would it be if my son is eating me? How would we respond to that as an audience, and how would you have had that encounter?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's a whole other thing, I think. Gosh, I don't know. Like, sons are. I don't know. I can't speak to that, I guess, because
you was a daughter that do you have?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
So I have two daughters, and I think I was having a lot of anxiety, like knowing that there was a lot of healing that had to take place in my family, and I felt like a responsibility to sort of take the first step in making that happen, seeing that it wasn't already taking place. And so I felt like this huge responsibility to do that for my family, for the women in my family that had experienced so much hardship throughout their lives, but then also like really thinking on the fact that I'm about to have a girl, a daughter, and what does that mean? I was really having a lot of anxiety about sort of transmitting unexamined issues onto her. And maybe that's kind of inevitable to a certain extent, because there's always parts of ourselves that require examination and that we learn. I mean, I feel like I'm constantly learning about myself, and I'm learning about myself as I'm looking at her and the way I speak to her and the things that I teach her. So it's still a learning process, but I knew that it was going to be a learning process that was going to be very intense from that moment that I.
Kind of, you do have male character. You do speak in the voice of.
I do speak.
I'm just trying to remember now. I was saying you do, but you do have a male character.
Yeah, there is a male character, and you're right. There is a son that has this very strong connection with his mother and feels very protected. Actually, there's at least two stories that have like a mother and a son, and I think in those stories, I was thinking a lot about the role of the father. I mean, there's always like a father that is making things very difficult for the family in my stories. And I think in those two stories, there was like a break that happened with the father. The father is no longer present for one reason or another. And again, I guess I keep returning to the idea of like breaking certain cycles, and thinking again about how they're difficult. I mean, that's just such an obvious thing to say, like it's difficult to break like cycles, but there's like there's things that we know we have to do, and like in theory, like we know that we have to do whatever, but when you actually try to practice it in your family, it's a whole other thing. Like you're risking everything, right? Especially when you've learned to center the family so much in your life, and to disrupt that is enormous. Like that's just really big. And the two stories that have the mother and the son have, they have like those big disruptions in their family. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, that might be a nice segue. I think maybe one of the stories is it the lime tree?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was gonna ask you about that in relationship to this story in a different way. I saw in both stories, some influence of maybe like fairy tale or folk tale, trajectories. And, I was just wondering if you could talk about maybe your influence. And then what Matia said about having a vocal quality made me think maybe it's just like the cadence of oral tradition or something like that. I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I think that's part of it. And I also like to read. I feel like there's something in the breath, like when I'm reading it, that has to feel right. So I'm always like very aware as to like how the air is moving in my body when I'm reading it, and if it works out loud the way I want it to, and it feels urgent when it needs to feel urgent, and it feels more peaceful when I want it to feel more peaceful. Like that's kind of like my test, when I read it out loud. And yeah, like the oral tradition is a real thing, and I learned to tell stories by listening to other people tell stories, like in kitchens and in the home, and just kind of being a quiet kid listening to people gossip, but really tell stories. And even gossip, like I've learned, I guess, over the years, chisme, I mean, it sounds like gossip, talking shit at each other, right? But there are lessons there that I've learned that I think gossip is a vehicle perhaps for teaching lessons to other people. And then you were making a point, about like fairy tale or like folk tale kind of thing. Yeah, I think definitely tied to like the oral practice of telling a story. And then I guess after I wrote it, I became more aware of certain things. Like there's a part that I wrote about the teeth of the mother, like they were bigger than she thought they were. And I thought, oh yeah, there's that, because I was rereading like Little Red Riding Hood to my kids, and there was the whole thing like, oh mom, your grandma, what big teeth you have. And I was like, oh yeah. So, and then like mothers and stepmothers and like women, female mother figures in fairy tales also are very peculiar and scary. Like I'm really attracted to those like mother characters that are so scary.
These aren't only stories, there are also many of them are allegories, right? And like this, the one you read is also an allegory of how we feed each other, right? And what it costs us, right? Like, and that's, and fairy tales are almost all allegories, right? Like there's this whole other layer other than the story content of like some kind of meaning that's being transmitted. And like one of the things I noticed, like in all of the stories, and we talked about this earlier, but the way that the parents don't know what to do with their kids, the kids don't know what to do with their parents, right? And this is a way in which, they kind of all know what to do with each other, and it's dark, right? It comes at a price. And that and also the other part where it really felt allegorical was when it moves from eating the mother to eating the letters. And then I was like, well, this is also an allegory of writing, right? Because the words aren't just being created, they're being eaten, and that becomes the fabric of the story. Right? These words that go both ways.
Yeah, I was thinking, I just remember now that you were talking about the costs. And that was also something I was thinking a lot about in wanting to learn more about myself and my mother. But I was also, and I find myself still sort of mourning the loss of like knowledge of the family. And I mean, I think this is particularly true. Maybe it's true for everybody to a certain extent, but like for people, those of us who have families that have migrated to this country from elsewhere and losing that connection to your culture and your history, and relying on your parents to tell you the stories of your family that may have been broken for different reasons. And what I'm getting at is that it started to feel for me at some point like it was too extractive, like asking family, and especially my mother, for stories. And it can be painful, and it was just too painful at a certain point. And I still think about that a lot. Like my husband's a historian, and we've conducted a lot of oral histories where we record people telling their life stories, and it can be a fine balance, like getting somebody to share their story, but maybe not pushing too much. Like sometimes people relive traumas, and you have to be careful with
You
that.
caught yourself eating your mother.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, mine was sort of related to that. I hope I can articulate this the way I want to, but I was really struck by that metaphor, that controlling metaphor of eating. We think of it as this celebratory thing, but actually it's an act of violence too,
Yes.
right? Eating. And so I just wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about how the ways that you shape the story around that metaphor, and if that's working through all the pieces for you.
Yeah, shaping around that metaphor.
Yeah. So it's so evocative,
Right.
Yeah. Maybe it wasn't working for you that way, but it's as a reader experiencing it, you just feel all the layers of the meaning of eating.
Right. Gosh, I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah. But it's just so, it was just really compelling in the work. And, the spiritual dimensions, the celebratory, but also just the violence of it too, right?
Right.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Is that, I thought the most powerful moment in that story for me was when you got to the point where you could only know your mother through your daughter having eaten you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was this
Yeah.
coming back on itself, and this goes to what you were saying about these stories being too difficult to tell or not being told, and yet there is this sort of story written in your DNA, in our DNA, that reaches back. My half the family, Ashkenazi Jewish, and they're all gone. There's nothing there anymore. And I don't know anything, but there is a story written on the DNA that it's okay to not know the story. And I don't know, I just got that vibe of it sort of hitting me.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just going off the wall.
Yeah, and I think just maybe going off of what you're saying, Michael, and maybe sort of indirectly replying to you, I guess maybe I was trying to think through other ways of knowing and learning that are not necessarily verbal, and how can we use the body, I guess, in different ways to access this knowledge. And even like as you're learning it, maybe it's not like, maybe it'll be verbal eventually or not at all. Like, I don't know, but I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I think that's something that I'm kind of interested in, even though I don't have all the right like vocabulary, like learning through different like.
That's the answer to Julie's question about eating, is that they actually, many of the stories have people learning things not through words, but in a bodily, experiential, like ingesting or expulsing or like doing things to their bodies, or having things done to their bodies.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Having all kinds of thoughts about that right now. Yes.
When you spoke earlier in class about becoming sort of more of a radical feminist when you became a mom,
Yeah.
can you talk about what becoming a writer who is a mom, like a writer working in the world as a mom, did to your feminism or to your concept of like your place in like the world?
Yeah. I think off the top of my head, there's something about being a writer and occupying space that I feel has been like a challenge, at least for me. Like the writing practice for some of us, like if you're writing a short story or something, like you're not like a studio artist that gets to take up like all this space and you have your materials that you're working with and you can show your process or whatever. Like as a writer, my process has been very contained and internal, but that doesn't mean that I don't get to take up space. And that's always like something that I feel like I'm fighting for in the world, especially, I mean, I grew up in a very small house with like my siblings and my parents, and space has always been like just very contentious. Like what do you get to claim as your own? How do you create room to grow in the ways that you need and want to grow? And as a mother, you're expected to give everything to your family and to your children, and they take up all of your space, like your body even, right? And then, so as a writer, I feel like I'm always like pushing to create space for myself in the world, and like even in the house, and even like understanding or helping or pressuring people in my family to try to understand me as a writer, because there are no other writers in my family. And so they don't understand this thing that I do or why I need time to myself. And it's always like a battle. Like it is like just, that's part of my life. Yeah.
One more question?
I hate to take up more space,
Sure.
but just on that, you know, I'm thinking of people I know, many people who are artists who had to get studio space, they have kids and then you go outside to do that. And of course, the thing you say about being a writer is often this kind of you and your notebook, or it always is, pretty much, or you read computer. And about how, I'm just wondering how you manage to carve out time or space, or where, so the practicalities of where you get to write, how you get to write, how you make time to write. Maybe you share those bits.
Gosh, I mean, it's looked like all sorts of different things. I mean, even when I was like breastfeeding a newborn, I was like sort of writing in my brain and like just kind of doing that. And then as soon as I could find my way back to the page, like I would write that down. Or like waiting for my kids to get out of school and I'm waiting in the car or whatever, like that's 30 minutes that I can write. Or more recently, my kids are in school or in daycare. So I got to a point where I could afford daycare, because that wasn't always the case, especially not during the pandemic. That wasn't even an option. And that's one way. And then another way, like just things that I've done to force time into the day is like having deadlines. So being a journalist has really provided me with a lot of deadlines, and that is real. And especially like if you're making some money off of that, like it's like I need to submit this thing by this time on this day, and if I don't get that in, I don't get whatever. But it is about the money. It's not about the money. It's like it really helps me to have a deadline that I'm gonna, and then people understand that, like, oh, you need to submit this thing to such and such publication by such and such time. Oh, okay, I'm like, hold press, like she needs to work. You know? So when it's like that, but if it's like, oh, you have a manuscript, what is it's a little trickier. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a reception next door.
That's great.